My name is Just Battis. I write speculative fiction, and we are on unceded Coast Salish territory right now, and we're at Iron Dog Books. And Emily, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I usually write speculative fiction. This is my first. It's not in stores yet. I just actually got my first peek of it when I got home on Saturday night. So it will be in stores soon, but it is the first YA novel I've written, or any novel I've written that doesn't have a ghost or a unicorn or a werewolf running through its pages. And it surprised me, in fact.
Yeah, there's like a ghostly quality, I think, but there isn't an actual ghost.
Yeah. It does have I don't think I'm able to write like pure realism. It comes out as a mystery or some kind of genre book anyway, even if it doesn't have a ghost or a unicorn in it.
There is, though, a villain named Jellybean, who is, it's pretty great. It's a pretty great villain.
Jellybean loves jelly beans.
Yeah. It's like a sinister nightclub owner yes. with a jelly bean theme who I just picture like Guy Branum or an actor like that, just being really sinister.
It's called Club Jelly. Yeah.
I want to go. Everyone wants to go there. What is this book about? The Winter Night. It's Arthurian knights are alive and well in the city of Vancouver. They are all hot messes. They're fighting amongst each other. And there's a murder at a fancy academic party. A fancy academic gets murdered. And there are two main and ellipses.
Is that why you invited me?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
No academics will get out alive. No, there are two main characters that have to solve this murder mystery. One is the reincarnation of Sir Gawain from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The other is a cranky Valkyrie detective named Hildy. So this section is from the perspective of Wayne, who is the reincarnation of Sir Gawain. He is very awkward and is a first-year undergrad. And this is a dream sequence. I almost always cheat and read from a dream sequence because then you don't have to deal with chronology or provide a lot of context. All you really need to know is that Wayne has a crush. His crush might also be a murderer named Bert, who is also a character from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And Wayne is having a very kind of surreal dream about Bert.
And Sesame Street.
And Sesame Street. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So this is from Wayne's perspective. Sun poured green through stained glass windows. Wayne crossed the nave. His boots made a faint crunching sound in the snow. It was falling in soft drifts from the vaulted ceiling. Crunch, crunch. It sounded like a monster gnawing on bones, though he tried not to concentrate on that. Sun from the windows, snow from the roof, and a wind whistling across unseen plains. He checked his weather app, but it was just a picture of a sad kitten, so that probably wasn't good. The light painted him green. He waggled his fingers, and the light curled around him like delicate strands of moss. He remembered reading that moss was the simplest tree possible. It thrived close to the ground, in the spots where everything stayed warm and still. Sometimes it spontaneously gave birth to itself. Wayne had conflicted feelings about church. His mother had been religious. He didn't know if she still was. She hadn't been dogmatic, but she liked the concept of God, a sort of waveform love that touched everyone across the universe. She also liked architecture. She was forever taking pictures of Gothic churches and telling him about graffiti, frozen in time. His mother taught him that the word grammar meant to scratch in a distant language. And that's all we were really doing, just scratching our lives onto a tricky substrate. There was a fox standing at the altar, cleaning snow from his paws. I should have known you'd be here, Wayne said. I'll interject and say that Wayne is being haunted by foxes in a way that is not exactly Fleabag season 2, but is not Fleabag season 2. The fox nipped at his tail, gave him a level look, and dashed behind the altar. Wayne followed, but by the time he peered around the corner, there was only a set of delicate paw prints. He heard a small cough. He turned and saw that the pews were no longer empty. Bert now sat about halfway back, reading a book. Snow fell on his black t-shirt. He walked down the aisle. Crunch, crunch. Why did it sound so much like bones? Bert looked up from his book. It was The Paper Bag Princess by Robert Munsch. Every book was covered in sticky notes. Hey, Bert said. Just studying up for my thesis defense. My supervisor's a dragon, so I'll need all the help I can get. Wayne smiled. Does that make you the princess? Bert put the book away. Shit doesn't fit in a box. He just heard this somewhere, but couldn't remember where. If it was Schrodinger's box, Wayne said helpfully. Shit both would and wouldn't fit. Bert got up. He grinned, then kissed Wayne swiftly on the cheek. You're my favorite footnote, he said. That's the most romantic line I've ever written. Wayne's heart hammered. Normally he'd freak out at this breach of his personal force field, but it didn't appear to function quite the same way around Bert. He was still nervous about physical contact, but part of him, a surprisingly insistent part, was constructing arguments about why it might be okay. Every thesis statement ended in how kissable Bert might be and how further research was required. Tell me a fable, Bert said, which is both not a reference to Ever After, but not a reference to Ever After. He laced his hand through Wayne's. The contact fizzed hot and cold. Soft flakes made a crown in Bert's black hair. He seemed like an unstable collective of crow feathers and weather systems and forest smells. It wasn't unpleasant, but something about it remained worrisome. Well, Wayne said, this one time I got cedar itch and my mom wasn't home, so my dad gave me a bath. It was weird because I was like 8, too old for communal baths, and my dad kept trying to distract me. He did all the voices from Jimmy Neutron, and then he'd break character and say, no scratching. And I laughed so hard that I farted in the bathtub. And then we both killed ourselves laughing. When my mom got home, that's how she found us. My dad was wheezing on the floor, and I was shaking with a towel around my shoulders. And she just kept yelling, what's happening? And she was so frantic, it made it funnier. But she still left, Bert said. Wayne blinked. How did you know that? He smiled. I know things, in this place anyway. They walked past the altar, into the vestry. Wayne expected it to be full of clothes, but instead it was brimming with plants. They were everywhere, and it was muggy. The snow had retreated. Bert picked up a watering can. He placidly watered a red fern, then moved on to the others. Sometimes he spoke to them with quiet encouragement. Wayne felt like he was seeing something almost too private, but it was also routine, as if Bert had been watering plants since the beginning of time. Your turn, Wayne said. What's your fable? Bert sat on the counter. Wayne joined him uncertainly. Their hands were almost touching again, but neither moved to close the circuit. If I had air roots, Wayne thought, they'd all be straining towards him right now. Typical story, Bert replied. Boy meets world, then everything goes sideways. Wayne swallowed around his nerves. Tell me who you are. Bert nudged him. You already know that. Do I? We've met before. We're always meeting. It's all we can do. His smile was a bit sad, but maybe that wasn't the word for it. Knights and monsters. They're made for each other. Who's the monster? Wayne asked. Bert shrugged. That's not for us to decide. At least tell me where you were born. What is this, a low-key question about immigration? Wayne rolled his eyes. No, I'm just curious. I was born in a forest. What, like a foundling? See for yourself. The plants grew, twisting until they were a forest canopy. Wayne sucked in his breath. He heard something in the distance, a low keening that might have also been an earthquake. Don't worry, Bert said. That's just the beast. He was now holding a bag of white cheddar popcorn. Want some? They both saw a boy playing Legend of Zelda in the middle of the forest. Wayne recognized the game. It was Majora's Mask, the one where he keeps getting stuck in a time loop. Link wore a mask that looked like a golden fox, But when he took it off, there wasn't a boy underneath. There was something with burning whole eyes and a mouth full of bloody roots. He stiffened. Bert's hand tightened around his own. It's only a game, he said. The boy and the forest both vanished. Now they were standing in Wayne's room. He was horrified to see his unmade bed, his records strewn all over the place, a pair of boxers crumpled on the floor. Bert walked over to the turntable. He lowered the needle. It was the Goldberg Variations, number 15, the plaintive end to the record's first sign. The same one he'd heard at the dean's house. This is the fancy academic party where someone got murdered. He felt nervous and filled with desire to explain something. Wayne said, "These were written as a lullaby for some cranky Saxon count who couldn't sleep." Bert replied, "They were written for you." Wayne said, Bert wrapped an arm around his waist. It's not going to get too sexy. Don't worry. I said this once. I was doing a reading with a colleague, and I read this section and said, "Don't worry, it's not going to get sexy." And then she read 3 pages of hardcore lesbian porn immediately afterwards. And I was like, why did I give that content warning? Really wasn't necessary. Bert wrapped an arm around his waist and pulled him closer. Wayne shivered. He put his hands on Bert's shoulders. He was hot like an element. He smelled like hardwood floors and cinnamon oatmeal and everything Wayne had ever lost. Every apartment they'd bid farewell, every friend who'd grown exasperated with him, every boy or girl who touched him in the dark and then quickly shrugged their shirt back on. "It's only a game," Wayne repeated. Bert smiled, "But we all have to play." He leaned in for a kiss. The door blasted open. His doorway was a tunnel. He saw something flying through the darkness, eyes like blazing holes in parchment, cigarette lighters glowing in red coils, a mouth large enough to swallow the whole apartment. Wayne screamed. When he opened his eyes, he was on the floor, panting, covered in sweat. He looked down and sighed. Monsters would be his fantasy.
It was so great to hear you read
Thank you.
section. Yeah, one of the beautiful things about the book is how strong the voice is, the narrative voice, and how familiar Wayne felt. Also, Hildy, I did a terrible job at introducing myself. I'm Emily Pohl-Weary. I write all kinds of things. This is my second YA novel. It's called How to Be Found. It's not on sale yet, but it will be soon. And it's, as I said, it's the first realism-ish novel I've written, which surprised me and took a long time. It is very drawn from my own teen years. I grew up in Parkdale in Toronto, and it took me this long to actually write about what it was like as a teen. I did think, like my main character, I was obsessed with Nancy Drew. Used to like investigate abandoned buildings in Parkdale. Oh, look, there's a needle. Who was here? No, I used to drag my best friend. I did actually like the 2 main characters live in an old house owned by my mother and her best friend. And she also had a daughter my age, so very similar to the situation in this novel. But most of it's made up, just the kind of way it felt to be a teen in Parkdale at the time. If you've been there, it's really gentrified now. But at the time, it was quite bleak. Although I felt very safe because I lived there. So, I knew the bike thief wasn't going to steal my bike because I'd just march over and yell at him. But yeah, I tried to really channel what it was like living there at the time. So yeah, How to Be Found. And I'm going to read from chapter 1. And it's funny you say like, not too much sexy content in your work, because I did a bit of an impromptu reading for teens and their parents at an event UBC has a program that sends MFA students into high schools. And we launched the annual anthology, and all the teens were there who were in the anthology, and their parents and their teachers. And my friend's like, Emily, you have a YA novel coming out. You should read a little from it. And I looked at the first line and I was like, I can't read this to this crowd. I feel like I'd be, I don't know, when you're there in that kind of capacity, it feels so different. And maybe I will get more comfortable with the book. But it's not like XXX rated or anything, but you'll see. So each chapter has a title, and the title is pulled from this book that the main character Mishi is obsessed with. The book is called A Girl's Guide to Murder: How to Get Away with a Perfect Crime. So each chapter has a chapter heading that is a chapter heading in A Girl's Guide to Murder. So this first one is Chapter 1, Planning the Perfect Crime. Trissa tucked her breasts back into her fuchsia sports bra and pulled up her hot pink sweater with rhinestones along the neckline. She flicked a red curl out of her face, popped the tip of her middle finger into her mouth, and sat there beside me, chewing on the stubby fuchsia nail and flipping the bird at the world. Trissa was the queen of not giving a shit. Juicy, said Red. My mouth is watering. Give me a bite. So gross, I snapped. Shut up, Mishi. Red's real name was Rocky, but nobody called him that. His orange armpit hair had earned him the nickname when it first grew in. Since he was the one who dared Trissa to flash everyone, he was obligated to act excited. Even though he probably hadn't seen much of anything, he was sitting on the far side of our circle of friends. The only light in the abandoned apartment came from a handful of candle stubs in the middle of the circle that I'd picked out of the nearby Greek Orthodox church's garbage. They were nicer than phone lights, but at this point they were burning dangerously low. Wouldn't last more than a few minutes. Doink! Doink! Screeched Red's little brother Timbit, and his auburn curls bounced all over the place. Laser beams shooting from her nipples. Doink! Hypnotized. Come here, Trissa, baby, said Red. I'm hungry. Top sirloin. Trissa's heel shot across the circle and connected with his shin. He yelped and rubbed the spot, even though it probably hadn't hurt much. Trissa's only response was to remove her middle finger from her mouth with a soft popping noise and hold it closer to the light so there was no mistaking her message. You gonna take that disrespect? Jeered Anton, who was sitting on Trissa's other side. He raised two beefy hands to encircle her neck like he wanted to strangle her. You gotta show a bitch who's boss. Red snickered. I shook my head in disgust. Nice, joking about a serial killer. The West End Strangler had been targeting girls our age for over a year. Police knew very little about him except that he was good-looking enough to pick up victims on dating sites. He drugged his victims, choked them to death, cut their bodies into pieces, packed them in cheap cargo bags, and tossed them into the lake. Body parts kept washing up, and girls were scared to walk alone at night, or at least more scared than they'd been before. So I grew up when Paul Bernardo was active, and really, the police came and searched all of our houses, at one point. So I was drawing from that with the West End Strangler. Trissa chewed her bottom lip. I heard the Strangler snatched someone a few blocks from Club Jelly last weekend. The air left my lungs, and for an instant, I couldn't inhale. She was talking about the exclusive nightclub downtown where she worked as a cage dancer on Friday and Saturday nights. That's 8 girls now, I said. That we know about, she said. Gotta admit he's effective, said Anton, cracking his knuckles. I couldn't figure out what Trissa saw in Anton. He treated her like gum, stuck to the bottom of his shoe, but she always messaged him when we were meeting up. It felt like he'd always been around and always would be, bringing my life down a couple of notches. He acted like the leader of our group just because he was a couple years older, and he always needed someone to pick on. He usually focused on Timbit because he wouldn't fight back. or Trissa because she was bright, shiny, and mouthy. Plus, it was easy to press her buttons. Anyway, in my opinion, Red deserved to be kicked for comparing Trissa's breasts to steak. On my left, Timbit was still shaking his head as if he was having trouble clearing his brain from the mesmerizing effect of nipples. He was a year and a half younger than most of us, only 15, but we let him hang because he'd found the master key card that allowed us to enter this unit. It was probably owned by a real estate investor waiting for the right time to sell. Also, Timbit and Red's parents owned a condo right across the alley, and if we froze him out, he'd just rat to his scary dad. Not like we did much in here. There was no electricity, running water, or furniture, but we didn't want to lose the only private space we had. I felt kind of sorry for Timbit, too. Most of us did, except Anton, who didn't experience human emotions because he didn't have his own friends. To be honest, it was so dark that me and Anton were the only ones who could see anything more than Trissa's general shape. The candles barely illuminated our faces, and Trissa was sitting back a ways. The shadows pressed inward, thick enough to touch. Anton didn't seem particularly interested, and it wasn't like her body was anything new to me. We'd grown up in the same house and started playing doctor at the age of 5. I squinted across the candles at the other two people in the room. My childhood friend Anwar and his perfect girlfriend Kelly D. Anwar's dimly lit face didn't give anything away, but he wasn't laughing. I could sort of make out the outline of Kelly D's body melded into his side. I didn't need light to know how perfect she looked. Her skin was smooth, her straight brown hair silky, and her green eyes flawlessly lined. Her skin and face and all the other parts of her body were perfect too. My hair was a rat's nest of overbleached frizz. My skin was pale, even after a summer spent outside. And my breasts overflowed from a Double G Bi-Mart special. They love to shop at Bi-Mart. I like to make up names of stores and brands. I have a lot of fun doing them. The underwire jabbed painfully into my armpits, and if I didn't keep my back straight, my fingertips tingled. I should have gone up a size, but was terrified to find out what the size above Double D was called. E for epic, enormous, elephantine. Anton's bulbous nose, heavy black brows flashed into sight when he used the screen of his phone to roll a joint with some sativa I had stolen from my mom. She smoked cannabis to keep her lupus symptoms under control. Though she was legally allowed to have 4 plants in the basement, she actually had more than 30 and sold the extra weed for cash. I stared at the sputtering candles, forcing myself not to fixate on Anton's dead fish eyes. He was clearly bored of Truth or Dare. The rest of us were too, but used the game as an excuse to pass the time together. If you hung out with the same people every day and nobody had much money, sometimes you had to get creative. Maybe I will stop. The rest of the chapter gets quite exciting.
Stop at the exciting part.
Yeah, stop before. Thank you. Thank you.
So we were talking at dinner about watching British mysteries and Australian mysteries. Maybe we could talk a bit about why we decided to write our mysteries. Do you want to go first?
Sure. As I said, I was trying to create what it was like to be a teen living on. I was a pretty precocious teen. I was like not afraid of much. Now, when I think back on some of the things I did, I'm like, what was I thinking? But I was one of these curious kinds of teens who wanted to try things and wanted to understand things. And I think I took this Nancy Drew kind of curiosity to make sense of stuff, resolve it. Why is this happening? Why is this thing that seems so wrong to me being allowed to occur? And so I wanted to create a character who had that kind of drive to do things, to make decisions, like Nancy Drew, to go out there and solve a crime without asking for permission. In YA, we still have a lot of like those tropes that I think are very sexist. Sexy.
Sometimes
okay,
both.
sexy too. The girl's in love with the guy and the whole novel's about the guy. So I wanted to play with that, sort of mix it up, turn it upside down, and make this girl who's kind of in love with her friend Trissa and kind of in love with this boy Anwar, who's also her best friend. And when Trissa, right after the scene, they go home, Trissa sleeps over, and the next morning, Mishi wakes up and Trissa's missing. She finds out 24 hours later when the police knock on her door. So she doesn't know what's happened. She can't get a hold of her. So I wanted that bond, that almost like closer than family, closer than lovers, boyfriends, girlfriends, closer than that kind of sexual relationship that teen girls can have. I wanted that to be the bond that forced her to go and figure out what happened to her friend. So the book is all about her searching for Trissa while this serial killer is killing women, girls in the neighborhood. And I don't know, there's something about the format of mysteries that really appeals to me. And I know it's not realistic to think that everything gets resolved on TV in an hour or 44 minutes, or, well, if it's a British show, it's usually actually an hour or whatever, hour and 5 minutes sometimes. I don't know why. I think of it as like a closet with a certain number of coat hangers, a certain size, and I have to resolve the story in some way or other. So that mystery format appeals to me to this day. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel similarly. When I was, am I telling this story? Yeah, I guess. Okay, so when I was a kid, my stepsister and I became convinced that the downstairs tenants were growing weed, and this was kind of late '80s. So this seemed really salacious to us, and so we created a detective agency in like there was a shed in the backyard. We met in the shed. Yeah, and yes, that's exactly what we were, tiny narcs. And this was our first case to like destroy the downstairs neighbors. So what we did is we wrote them a note and slipped it under the door of their basement suite, and it just said, "We know who you are. We know what you're doing." That's all it said. And so of course, they delivered the note to our parents and said, why are you raising two sociopaths? But yeah, that idea of solving mysteries, I think, was always there. Yeah. And what's so strong, I think, in How to Be Found is the relationship between Mishi and Triss, and how Triss is she's absent for 90% of the novel, but she's still there. Mm-hmm. How did you find that writing experience, like writing a character who's not actually present, but still making them present?
Oh, geez. Yeah, I was so worried about that because everyone says if you introduce a character in your first chapter, that character is going to be a main character, so don't get rid of them, or the reader will feel really upset. But Trissa is so much a part of Mishi's life, their family. They're like sisters. They're very close. Her mother is an auntie to Mishi, which is similar, as I said, to how I grew up. So I still call her auntie. And I think I was relying on the presence of Trissa in Mishi's mind and memory so much because I wanted to keep that story moving, to kind of show the complexity of their relationship and how they grew apart. So they're close, but they are not close the way they were as kids. And social pressure, identity, the difference between their mothers, that all shapes them, how people treated Trissa versus how they treat Mishi. And so Mishi's making sense of this all and realizing how she didn't see the way Trissa protected her. And I think growing up, I felt that way. I was the kid who would like read and make up stories. And my friend who lived in the same house was the wild dancer, extroverted. And I would kind of say, no, I don't think I want to do that. Or I just watch while other people did it. So it's creating that dynamic between the two girls There's so much love between them. They're always going to be bonded no matter what happens with Trissa. I don't want to give away the end, but I think it's a bit of an opportunity to explore Mishi and her responsibility in terms of how they sort of come apart as friends.
At first, when Mishi starts kind of acting on her feelings for Anwar, I was furious because I was like, no, this is a love story between her and Trissa. But I love how you put it, that like their relationship is actually beyond that. Mm-hmm. It's a very particular, it's like Angela and Rayanne from My So-Called Life, you know, that kind of like ride or die.
Yeah.
And with the kind of a queer potential, but I love how you kind of shaded that, but always kept it a bit ephemeral. I tried to do something similar with the character of Wayne. His mother has left, and there's not really an explanation why. And he spends a lot of time trying to figure that out, going to therapy to figure it out. My own mother was very dissatisfied at the ending of the novel because you don't really find out why Wayne's mother left, but I was sort of like, can I embed a little mystery that doesn't get solved? And I was really interested in the idea of a mother in particular leaving and not being tremendously judged by every other character in the novel. So I found that kind of challenging, like writing mysteries within mysteries. My previous work is more kind of forensic related. And so with The Winter Night, I wanted to have there to be less violence. And I wonder how you balance that in How to Be Found as well, because it is a YA novel. Although you can show quite a bit of violence in YA now, but I think yours is a lot more subtle.
Yeah, I didn't want the violence to be overt because I think a lot of times we read these stories, they're like worst case scenario, the person's life is destroyed. I wanted to show what it's actually like to be a teen girl. At least when I was a teen girl, there is a constant threat. Like if you're woman identified, if you're not a cis white man, basically there's a constant threat in your life. Everywhere you look, there could be danger, and you don't know, you can't necessarily control whether you get hurt because it's everywhere. But so many girls, I'm making it sound so much more serious than the book actually feels, I hope, reading it, but there is violence everywhere. I wanted to be honest about that. I wanted to say, like, have this relationship with these teens who hang out together all the time, don't necessarily all get along, but they live together in the same area and hang out and show the way that girls kind of brush it off and keep going, like the survivors, right? The ones who just keep going. Those stories are not often told, especially in YA. It's like, a horror story, a warning, or a girl who attracts the most beautiful boy, even though she's quite plain. And, and that is like absolutely adores him no matter what he does, what horrible things he does, right? So I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to go to the this is going to be, I'm going to make an example out of these girls. I wanted to be more honest in a way, because I think so many girls are walking that like razor's edge of potential. Something potentially terrible at any time could happen. Sometimes horrible things happen and they just keep going and don't even stop to think about it because they can't. I want to have these girls who are like that, who have love, have this non-traditional family, know who matters to them, what matters to them, how they feel about things, and are, in control in a certain way, the way girls can be, okay with their sexualities, okay with how they feel about people, not afraid to be themselves, but still living in a society that's like Parkdale and many places now, which was quite working class and bleak when I was young. I found it so interesting. You managed to have this mystery, but there's so many like so many layers to your story, and the whole like folklore, creating these characters who are reincarnations of these ancient folk heroes, and how that added a complexity to it. So I was constantly picking apart, like, who is this person as an individual? Who are they as a trope, as like a folktale trope? And I wondered if you could talk about how did you manage to bring both together, bring that all of that fantasy and historical kind of oral stories into the now, into Vancouver. It feels very of the now.
It's funny you say that, because when I submitted the final draft manuscript, my editors sent me this very gentle email, and they were like, so we noticed that none of your characters are listening to music that is, less than 20 years old. It is possible that you are, in fact, old, and you need to update, because these are teenagers. I said, well, they're 19 and one is an old soul, but no. So I'm glad that it did kind of resonate as being contemporary. A lot of it started because I would teach classes on King Arthur, and I discovered my students did not care about King Arthur as a character. They cared about like Morgan Le Fay and Merlin and all the like gay wizards that were all like, if you're a wizard, you're not a cis person. Like, if you can turn into a bird, you're not cis. You're transitioning constantly. So they were into the minor characters, and so I think I wanted to draw some of those minor characters in. In terms of like how to manage that, I couldn't let the medievalist in me take over, because then I would be like, oh, this manuscript from the 13th, like nobody cares. So I had to.
You did really well.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I tried to find little details from sort of diverse versions of the stories and put them in, but not focus too much on all of the different incarnations. The fun sections were when sort of Hildy is consulting her files on these characters, and it'll be like Morgan Le Fay. She has 17 aliases. Sometimes she's just a stone. Like, these were all kind of like taken from the kind of weirder, more minor stories. So I tried to say, give each character kind of a few characteristics. But what I took for Wayne was that, Wayne as a knight he has this big reputation. I can't say that without hearing Taylor Swift now. Big reputation. So he has this massive reputation that follows him around, but he's actually a very inexperienced knight who's quite anxious. And I tried to sort of graft that onto Wayne as a character. Like, what would it be like if you're an anxious undergrad who's trying to negotiate the disability accommodation system, but you can like barely look people in the eye? So those were some ways I kind of tried to weave that in, but I'm glad it kind of cohered in that way.
He's very much himself. He's not a stereotype or a straight retelling of straight, as a pun as well, but not a direct retelling. And so you forget, and then you're reminded suddenly. And I kept thinking how clever it was that you pulled that off so seamlessly. Because it's a lot. Like, you're reading a mystery, but there's also a fantasy element, and then the fantasy element is drawn from stories most of us know, but that didn't take over the story. It didn't take over the drive of each character, and I found that very nicely, deftly done, with all the humor, all the things that you're putting in there, the angst, the vulnerability, all of the things that young 20s. They're in their young 20s, early 20s, right? Yeah,
I don't know if you're experiencing this as well, but I find it's trickier to put myself in the mind of a 19-year-old. Like, I'm sort of dimly recalling my undergrad experience, but trauma has wiped most of that out, right? It's just like it's full of holes, and so.
Yeah, I think I've like stunted growth, like emotionally or something. My sister says I have the sense of humor of a toddler, so at least
great.
19's a little bit older than a toddler. No, they're 16 and a half, 17. I like fart jokes and poop jokes and things like this. She is much younger than me and much more dignified. No.
I think fart jokes have cross audience appeal,
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers the
I think so.
question. I think I'm not very mature myself. And also, I had such a horrible time as a teen that I feel like I constantly need to rewrite it. Maybe one day I'll move on and it'll be like 25. No, actually, my first novel, they were 20. The main character's 24. Then I got younger. Sorry. Maybe I will mature and then my fiction will mature. But in the meantime, I'm stuck on the teens, I guess.
That sounds like a great arc. We're going to mature.
One day, my 60s or 70s.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we should expand it, open it up to Q&A then.
Okay, I was really struck by the side-by-side of your two readings, which felt to me like queer fantasy and straight horror. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about, it was like articulating to a friend the other day the hand signals that my friends and I made up when we were 18 and dancing in clubs. We had hand signals to indicate to you what kind of man was about to touch you non-consensually and like how bad it was going to be. And it was like a fun joke. And I was describing this to my friends and I was like, well, growing up as a girl is horrifying. Wow. And I would love to hear you talk, both of you, a little bit more about trying to articulate the sort of unspoken textures of sexuality in particular, like which is so tricky as a thing to name and articulate outside of the way we generally write sexuality, which is in relation to actively having sex with somebody, I guess, how it sort of shows up in our culture, and trying to because that scene felt so queer, even though textually nothing particularly gay happened in it. And that scene felt so disgustingly heterosexual, even though no technically straight thing happened in it. So how are we getting at these textures?
Ooh, sexuality. Let's talk about it, huh? I was recently at a reading and I was asked a question about gender and I literally said, not gender. And that was my response.
You're welcome. Sex instead.
Let's talk about it. There's a character in The Winter Night who's asexual, and that was an interesting process for me because at first I thought I was doing research, and then I was like, oh no, this is actually part of your own sexuality in a way that you have not had time to examine. But it was an interesting process to talk about this character, especially because she's kind of a hard-boiled detective who usually, that type of character usually has a lot of unsuccessful relationships. And there's a scene where she sits down with her friend and talks about I've had all these relationships where they seem to be going well, and then all these feminist people that I keep dating are like, why aren't you giving me blowjobs? Or why aren't we sleeping together on the second date because we've had second? She's just like, I don't know how to navigate this. And that was the first time I had really talked about that in a book. I found it really challenging, talking about kind of sex removed from a really particular physical type of sex. With Wayne, I once had a review on Amazon and it just said, why the awkward sex scenes? ? It's for one of an older book. I feel like every sex scene I've ever written has been awkward because I think all sex is awkward. Bodies are weird. And with Wayne, I tried to sort of channel that as a character who is fine with having sex, but is still going to be super awkward about it. And when that moment does arrive, it's, to me, feels like something that could happen in the real world. Like someone falls off the bed, someone tries to take their pants off before they've taken their shoes off. You get in bed and you're like, this angle's not going to work. Neither is this one. To me, that's just really normal, but it did feel challenging to talk about. It almost felt dirtier to talk about sex with either removed from sex or sex in a kind of awkward way. So that's my non-answer to that question. What do you think, Emily?
Well, again, I had to go back to what it was like to be a teen. And so a lot of my first experiences were with my friends, my girlfriends, figuring out our bodies, what felt nice, what didn't. And then there's this like deluge of, I don't know what the right word, I don't want to say desire. I don't think it's desire. It's like this expectation boys have that they have to like hunt or something, hunt the girls. Otherwise, they're not real boys. There's this like pressure to do that. At least I did. I learned to like exist despite it, just kind of like walk on by, keep going or not. I'd be like, oh, cute or whatever. So it's this sexuality part. Like, I also grew up in a family with feminist mom. They didn't tell us things were bad. 1960s mom gave me our bodies ourselves, the joy of sex. They had has anybody seen that hilarious TikTok video about the like cake and party when the girl gets her first period? Literally my mother and my friend's mother upstairs were dancing around, "You're a woman now," and I was like, well, but what do I do with this thing? How do I get it in? Like, what do I do with this tampon? So they were like shouting instructions through the door and then dancing around. So it wasn't a repressive environment at home that way. So it's kind of like whatever goes, goes. Leave them alone. They're kids. They're learning about their bodies. And I think it was probably pretty unusual. It wasn't like they left us alone and said, you are, alone and must fend for yourself. My mother is like ferocious. Yeah. The few times she took on my teachers at school was like a nightmare. It was like some sort of bomb went off. But at home, there wasn't a lot of pressure to be a certain way. In fact, I think like I learned from friends about shaving my legs, about wearing bras, about makeup. My mother never, I was like, oh, really? Okay. You want to start shaving? Go for it. So there were a lot of things that, I felt it was a performance in a way. I'd go out into the world and perform the role I was supposed to perform and then come home and be more comfortable, like a chameleon. And I think that to me is what gender felt like. My dad actually was quite similar. I mean, he dressed my brother and I identically, like he would get us the same presents, shirts that were terrible tubular things, not for my body. So I think, yeah, I was writing kind of what it was like for me. And I do think at that age, you're closer to your friends than you are to somebody you're dating. It matters more. They last longer, those friendships. One of the horrible things about YA is this messaging that you'll find your like forever mate who's like a 400-year-old vampire when you're 16, and you'll be like, you are fated to be with me for the rest of eternity. And I think that's pretty harmful. I mean, you don't even know who you are at that age, right? Like, you don't know what you like. You're still figuring out who you are and how you want to be in the world. So I just have my girls be themselves in a way in that kind of an environment where there's not like, this is naughty, you're going to get in trouble or what have you. It's more just like they're so close. They sleep together the same bed, they argue, they share each other's clothes, they do all of those things that best friends do. So I think it was important to me to explore that at the same time, that fine line between like a platonic girl friendship and not purely platonic. I don't even know, because it's not like, there's a lot of
the other kind of Socratic girl friendship.
Yeah. There are troubles between them. They don't always get along. They're kind of bitchy to each other. So there's like ups and downs, right? But your friend is your friend. Your sister is your sister. You're going to always have them in your life, regardless of how bitchy they are. And whether they steal all your dolls and cut their hair and dye them red, which happened to me, I will say that is actually something that happened to me. My friend cut all my doll's hair and dyed it red.
Does anyone else want to say their favorite knight? Their favorite Arthurian character? Yeah, or your favorite mystery? Yeah. No one? Is Sir Gawain your favorite knight?
My favorite knight is from let's get real nerdy here. My favorite knight is from a 15th century Middle English text. Middle English is like what my students call funny English. So like before Shakespeare, that awkward period. There's a 15th century text about a trans masculine knight named Sir Grisandolus who meets Merlin on the road. And Merlin is like, there's something about you. Not quite sure. And then he sort of figures it out and says, oh, you've got a secret you're not telling people. And Grisandolus says, don't tell anyone. Merlin says, I didn't foresee this in my prophecy, but yeah, okay, I've got secrets too. I'll keep yours if you keep mine. So Sir Grisandolus is probably my favorite. He marries an emperor and is just like, let me wear whatever I want and I'll marry you. And it's always surprises my students because they don't expect to encounter trans people in the Middle Ages. But there are trans people everywhere.
I don't know if I have a favorite knight, but I like Robin Hood.
Oh yeah, there's a Robin Hood story where Robin Hood is captured by an evil nun, and she drains all of his blood and murders him at the end. And there's no moral. It's just don't piss off murderous nuns.
Yeah, evil murderous nuns. I think I was probably smoking weed in my both English and history classes in high school.
So was your teacher, probably.
Behind
likely.
the church. I think you've done a fantastic job. Everyone should buy this book. And buy mine in September when it comes out.
We're both great.
By the winter night. And I'm so happy that you asked me to do the event with you. I was like, how are our books similar? And then I started reading and I was like, oh.
Wait a minute. Yeah, this worked out really well, I think.
Yeah, there's so many. It's hard to even explain how, but it just felt like these are people I know. These people could exist in the same world as my characters, despite being these Arthurian knights reincarnated. Yeah.
One of the things I love about How to Be Found too is that the setting, I think, is like slightly unusual for a mystery. There aren't as many Canadian mysteries. And yeah, that focus on this sort of, what are we calling it? Socratic friendship? Sapphic Socratic or something.
That works. Yeah.
It was really nice that it doesn't slide into being primarily a romance, that you have this central character who's just so appealing and compelling, but dealing with kind of past versus present. And all the nods to Nancy Drew, I thought were great.
And even, she's in love with this boy, Anwar, such as it is at that age. But really, he's her sidekick. He's like her Robin to her Batman. So
yeah, doesn't she literally fish him out of a dumpster?
Yeah,
like he gets the shit beaten out of him.
Does,
and then Michi's the one that gets him out of the dumpster.
Yeah.
And she's kind of like, you all right? Okay, go.
Let's make out.
Yeah. That's what you do.
Yeah.
I'm Jess Battis, and I wrote The Winter Night.
I'm Emily Pohl-Weary, and I wrote How to Be Found, which will be out in September.